Thank you very much, David, and thanks to the Weststar Institute for inviting me to give this workshop and giving me an opportunity, for the first time, I think, to present a sort of resume of my thinking to an American audience. I certainly hope that some of what I'm going to say will resonate with you, because America, as a Protestant country and an Enlightenment country, embodies at least some of the themes of my theology, because I've wanted over the last 25 years to shift the focus of religious attention from the next world to this world, from the basic orientation towards the monastery and the celibate life, towards private life and the ordinary life of the people, from eternity to time, and from necessary truth to the changing, contingent world. I'm trying, if you like, to do what in the 60s was called secularize religious thought, but I have suggested we should rethink that and say that what we've been seeing happening in the last 20 years is not really the secularization of religion, but the sacralization of ordinary life. That's why I'm starting this book, this series of sessions, by talking about the word life, which has been an important strand in my thinking for the last 5 years. 5 years ago, I was casting about for a new way of presenting philosophy and theology to an audience that was getting pretty impatient with both subjects. And I had the idea, coming from Wittgenstein, of a reverse approach. I tried to find out what philosophical and religious ideas ordinary people already have, because they're built into everyday language. Wittgenstein has familiarized us with the idea that ordinary language is basic, that the ordinary life of people, ordinary human social life, is basic, and it already has a philosophy, a worldview, an ethic built into it, which we can never wholly leave behind. But very few efforts have been made to find out in detail exactly what the worldview of ordinary people is, and even less effort has been made to find out how it's changing. I did get some time ago an idea that we could do something on this by thinking about the case of life after death. I found myself wondering whether ordinary people do in fact believe that they will have further experiences after death. One way of looking at this would be to look at death notices in papers and funerary inscriptions over the last 3 or 4 centuries. In the English context, it's very noticeable for all who visit churches that in the 17th century, tombs still carry a traditional inscription about the last judgment and the general resurrection of the dead and so on. In the 18th century, this has changed to an inscription extolling the virtues of the deceased and expressing the hope that they'll stand her or him in good stead when we have to render account to our Maker. In the 19th century, there may be some attempt to restore a richer theological language, but on the whole, the main emphasis is on the greatness of the achievements and the social rank of the person. In the 20th century, death comes to be spoken of as sleep, and people are spoken of as reunited and so on, and all explicit talk about life after death disappears from tombstones as it does from sermons at funeral services. Today, even in the most conservative circles, when you go to a funeral, you don't expect to hear a sermon exhorting you to repent and change your life, because we must all face the last judgment. That will be orthodox, but those people who pride themselves on their own orthodoxy and nothing like as traditional as they pretend to be. The old eschatology has gone. Well, this was an example of how an empirical study program might illustrate the way religion is developing over a long period. And I had the idea of doing something similar with ordinary language. It's a puzzle for anyone who's worked in the parish ministry to know what ordinary people really think. But one way to find out what they really think would be to collect the stock phrases current in ordinary language, perhaps try to date them if possible, and find out what worldview we're all drawing upon every day in our speech. So I began to try to collect idioms. I began making notes and jotting down phrases and so on. And I still have, even now, the first pages I made about 5 or 6 years ago. I started jotting down stock phrases about the meaning of it all and so on, philosophically interesting phrases that are current in ordinary language, that you can hear on the media, that you've perhaps used yourself, you've heard other people use, and that you can find in reference books. I started buying dictionaries, and I noticed that dictionaries published before about 1920, when they're illustrating the use of language, quote canonical writers, but there's very little quoting of the stock phrases used by ordinary people. However, in the last 20 years, dictionaries have made a very big shift over towards ordinary language and stock phrases. If you teach modern languages, you'll know that the standard English to French, French to English, and English to German, German to English dictionaries nowadays teach the student a very large number of stock phrases, because you can't understand the language unless you know these phrases. So I've used those dictionaries as examples, as sources for the phrases I was trying to collect. It's very noticeable that the best recent Oxford Dictionary similarly abandons quotations from canonical writers and quotes the language of the people. The reason why this is interesting is that stock phrases have gone through a kind of Darwinian selection. When you've been in a situation when the stock phrase has seemed to be le mot juste, it's said just what you want to say, crisply and clearly, you've heard it before, it's available to you, you use it again. It clicks. And phrases like that spread. Let me give an example. A phrase I early tried to date and place was "get a life." Well, the best I came up with was a use of it by Richard Rorty in 1989. That's the earliest I could find. I started looking for the origin of that phrase and thinking what it tells us about the way people nowadays see life. Well, it was phrases like that I began to collect. My first idea was simply to investigate the common religious philosophy of ordinary people. Nobody has ever found out what ordinariness really involves. I would try to do that. And here are the first 2 sides that I wrote down 6 or 7 years ago, and I've gone over them with a highlighter pen, marking up the words that occurred most frequently. And they are life, which occurs 6 times on the first page and 4 on the second, and it all, which occurs 6 times on the first page and 4 times on the second. That's very striking. It began to seem to me that ordinary people use a number of words in rather the way we used to use the word God, to describe what it is that we're up against, what we have to come to terms with. These words are life, it all, things, everything, to some extent fate, chance and fortune, and a few more. But the most striking were life, it all, things and everything, which are used almost interchangeably. In Britain, and I think probably here as well, when you're asking somebody what sort of lot God has been dishing out to them lately, you say nowadays, how's life been? How are things? How's it all been going? How have you been treated lately? What's life been like for you? We use phrases of that kind and we talk of things or everything. How are things? How's everything going? Very striking. In another book recently, I found 10 of these periphrases for God, which show the ways in which the word God is changing in current speech. In a book called The Meaning of It All in Everyday Speech 2000, I listed 450 idioms in current English that I had found after about a month's preparation for this little book. In the Life book, I found, that's the book called The New Religion of Life in Everyday Speech. I found 150 religiously significant life idioms in everyday speech, which everybody will recognise. And by the way, you will notice that although we hear nowadays how pluralistic society is, despite all the pluralism in modern Britain, everybody's heard these phrases, and despite the very considerable differences in idiom between English and American English, I think nearly all my phrases are recognised over here. The differences are pretty small. In fact, phrases that become current in here become also current in Britain within a year or two. So I collected phrases, and it began to seem that life is the most interesting and important word of all. It has the richest idioms, is used in the most obviously religious way. The example with which I begin life concerns the death of Princess Diana in the year 2000, was it? When Prince Charles and the Queen both recorded short statements for television. They were keen to come across warmly. There have been sharp critics. I beg your pardon, I'm getting this wrong. I'm talking about the death of the Queen Mother in the year 2001. But at the time of the death of Princess Diana, there had been criticism of the royal family for withdrawing into private grief. So the Queen and Prince Charles both recorded public statements that were shown on television. What was striking about these statements is that despite her own personal faith, the Queen used no traditional religious language at all, but used only the word life. And Prince Charles used no traditional religious language at all, but used only the word life, though his outlook is a bit different from his mother's. Two of his uses of the word life were notably Nietzschean. What it seems has happened is that life has become our most popular totalizing word in the last 20 years. We now use it because we can't use traditional religious language in public. Let me give an example which everybody will recognise in Britain. I think most of you will probably recognise here. When a much-loved young woman dies and people want to pay tribute to her and express their grief at her tragic death and so on, in England today, you would never say she loved God, but everybody says she loved life. Is that true here as well? Something similar? People praise the dead for their love of life, almost universally now, but never for their love of God. To an extraordinary extent, within the last 20 or so years, the word God has been dropping out of everyday speech, and the word life has been replacing it. Several professional writers have told me that this happens, and I notice the word life in this strange new sense being put in inverted commas quite frequently by, for example, Virginia Woolf, 60 or 70 years ago. But the big changeover is in the last 30 years or so. By the time I got my first 100 idioms, I dug out the old Oxford English Dictionary, the great big multi-volume thing, and looked it up on Life, where there are many columns, to see how many of my 100 phrases it listed. The answer was 1. It was published in 1907. Amazingly, the shift towards life in everyday language has happened entirely in quite recent times. The only life idiom still in use now that was already in use in about 1907 when the volume on Life appeared was the phrase life force, which had already been given currency by people like vitalist biologists and Bernard Shaw and so on. Life force. That was astonishing because it now seemed to me first that I was discovering something interesting about the worldview and the beliefs of ordinary people. I was also discovering something interesting about how religion is changing in our time. I also had to give some kind of history. In the Life book, one bad mistake is made. I missed, through sheer negligence, the single most important statement by an early writer of the new point of view. It comes near the end of Tolstoy's War and Peace. It's Pierre's meditations when he's in captivity. Pierre says, life is everything. Life is God. To love life is to love God. Everything moves and shifts and changes together, and that movement is God. So very striking indeed, for about 1860, when Tolstoy was finishing War and Peace. I did find some earlier very striking uses. The poet William Wordsworth, for example, is already speaking just of biological life, of the pleasure of being alive, the pleasure that there is in life itself, from the poet Martin. In a very modern-sounding way, about 1795 or so, Wordsworth was very innovative in that in Christian culture, and coming from a strongly Anglican and Cambridge background, where he should have been very Platonist, he's already praising the life of sensations, the emotions, and the body, and talking about living by the heart, as if he's a kind of century earlier version of D.H. Lawrence. It was in Henry David Thoreau I found one or two very vivid examples of the switch to life. Do you remember when Thoreau goes into live alone in the woods at Walden in order to wrestle with life, and he's quite clearly modelling what he plans to do on Jacob wrestling alone with God by the brook Kidron in Genesis. But his life he wants to wrestle with, his life that he wants to tell the truth about itself. 1860s, is that? I don't know it off the cuff. But that's a very striking example from this side of the water. Another example from the other side, in one of his last novels, Rainbow, Lawrence has one character who particularly uses the language about life in a way that's modelled on traditional talk about God. For example, seek life first, which obviously echoes seek ye first the kingdom of God in the teaching of Jesus. I found four such phrases on one page of the Rainbow, and I now began to realise that the word life is so short a word and so commonly used and so on, we don't notice what big changes are happening to it. What seems to have happened is that pioneering writers, roughly between 1800 and 1920, are trying out these new ways of thinking. Gradually they've spread to the people and have become universal. Gradually, an orientation of religious thought towards life, just the movement of human social life in this world, just ordinary everydayness, has become universal. Another example of it spreading to philosophy, the phrase life-world, life-world. Edmund Husserl, 80 years ago, a good example of the word getting to philosophy. And of course, above all, Nietzsche, for phrases like life-affirming, life-enhancing, life-denying, and so on. So all this was very extraordinary, very exciting to discover, but it gave me problems with dating. How could I date the life idioms with any confidence? Well, you have to rely on your own sense of the language and your own reading and various little tricks. For example, film titles have a date, and it's often through film titles that a particular phrase quickly becomes current in the language. I started jotting down phrases I'd heard in films, like "we have a duty to life." The Night My Number came up, a war film of the early 50s. As Good as It Gets, Jack Nicholson. The dates on film titles, titles of songs and so on, give me a little bit of a clue towards dating. As I say, many phrases prove much harder to date than others. The meaning of life, I have no doubt, is 1930s, but it's a tricky one. But I did what I could in dating anyway. So far then, I got to the conclusion that ordinary people do have a rather striking, emergent, new religious philosophy, already built into their language, and to some extent it's affected the Orthodox as well. Somebody's told me that in the 80s the Billy Graham organisation received an award from an advertising council for its use of the word life in its publicity. And pro-life and anti-life and so on have become stock phrases in the debates about abortion and so on. It's usually biological life that's being talked of there and is being sacralized, but at any rate, some influence of life talk has affected both evangelicals and Roman Catholics, as well as the mainstream of novel-reading members of the population. What about the question of the turn to ordinariness, the giving of primacy to ordinary life that's involved here? That story is, I think, fairly familiar. It's beginning an affirmation of, a defence of, ordinary civil life against its critics begins to appear in the towns along the Rhine in the late Middle Ages, and the emergence of domestic subjects and interiors as subjects for painting. In the Reformation, it becomes actually part of Protestant ideology, of course, that you can serve God and in domestic life and in your daily work, though a lay person. The traditional Catholic sharp division between the religious life, governed entirely by the Church, and secular life in the world, comes under very sharp criticism, and Protestants seek to raise the moral standing of family life and of work. That greatly influences the Calvinist tradition and, of course, the whole culture of this country. We in Europe think of it as being perhaps most vividly realised in Dutch painting of the 17th century, in those lovely, calm, composed interiors that we meet in the paintings of Jan Vermeer and Pieter de Hooch. Very charming. They represent an ideal of peaceful domesticity which has always greatly appealed to the English. What about the triumph of ordinary life later? The crucial thing, as it seems to be, was the growth of cities in the 19th century, and in particular the installation in cities of modern water and sewage systems in the mid-century, and then the emergence in Impressionist painting of a new, completely non-ideological painting of ordinary people and ordinary life. People just sitting under the trees in the Bois de Boulogne, sitting in rowing boats on the river, and so on. What's always appealed to me, what I still enjoy about plein air impressionism, is its stout defence of orderliness. It's saying that the old ideologies, the old aristocratic order is gone. This is the triumph of democratic orderliness, and I think it is no accident that the finest collections of Paris Impressionist and post-Impressionist paintings were made and are now in this country. I imagine Americans recognise something that they too are very enthusiastic about. It is the extraordinary thing, but that triumph of democratic orderliness didn't really reach Britain till a generation later, I think. It's coming out after about 1900. It's surprising that it emerged so early in Paris, because in the 1870s, Paris had only just gone through the extreme horrors of the Franco-Prussian War. But within 3 or 4 years, Monet and Renoir are painting it as paradise. And ordinary life seems completely restored. Well, what are the consequences of this huge shift for religion? One that strikes me very obvious is that the old extreme long-termism of medieval and monastic religious thought comes to an end. Instead, religion becomes much more short-termist in a way that it already had in Protestantism. You don't see the earthly paradise or the restoration of paradise as being hundreds of thousands of years away in purgatory or whatever, or after many lifetimes, as the Buddhists would say. No, the finding of eternal happiness in the present moment, in some way or another, becomes a very urgent concern of religion. With the old long-termism goes two worlds dualism. Two, people begin to dislike the very sharp contrast between the relative unsatisfactoriness and worthlessness and corruption of life here below and the perfect happiness and unchanging joy of life in the world above. People begin to object to that contrast, the devaluation of this world and this life. Instead, religion becomes more short-termist. It says yes to transience and is willing to affirm the beauties of this world. I had an amusing example of this when, after debating these issues with a Roman Catholic nun, who was a friend of mine, she sent me further contributions to the debate on postcards of Monet's paintings of the river. Those paintings where the whole thing, the whole painting, appears to be, as it were, watery. There's nothing substantial at all. Monet seems to paint the light hanging in the air between things, rather than things themselves. She changed over from the old Catholic view that you should only value the most unchanging and eternal things, to the new view that it's the transient beauties that move our hearts most deeply. I'm suggesting that the old cosmology of God, the world and the self is increasingly being replaced by a new cosmology of life and my life. There's life in general, and there's each person's particular state in life. And it's part of the thesis of life that nowadays we use the term my life in much the same way as we use the term my soul. Your life is what you must claim responsibility for, what you must own, what you yourself must take the basic decisions about. As life has become longer and more predictable, we're aware of being able to plan our lives. We can't just say that the course of our life is in the hands of God and we've no idea what will happen. To a surprising extent, we can make long-term plans for our own lives. And people increasingly nowadays want themselves to take the great decisions about their own life. They're not willing to be pushed into the job and to marry the partner that their parents have chosen. In Britain, we have had many cases of young people who have been willing to commit suicide rather than agree to and undergo an arranged marriage. These people could be considered martyrs for the region of life because they hold that my life is sort of sacred. I mustn't sell it. I mustn't allow other people to control it. One must claim moral responsibility for one's own life. It's a new thing, and it may be a shock to you when your own children start to claim it against you. But it is a fundamental fact of our time, and one we should take very seriously. I've got one last new thing to mention, whether we should speak of life as being like God or life as being like everything. There is an important difference here. In the old dualism, you made a sharp distinction between the perfection of God in the heavenly world and the mixed, deeply imperfect character of the earthly world. If you want to undo that distinction and say that all life is holy, we should commit ourselves to life, we should not be very judgmental, we should, so far as possible, affirm everything, then we're beginning to treat everything or life as a rather different object from God. Saying yes to life is rather like saying yes to marriage as a package deal. When you say yes, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health. When you committed yourself to God, you committed yourself to an absolute perfection which you hope to one day to see completely triumph. When you commit yourself to life, you commit yourself to it, good and bad, as an animal does and must. An animal loves life and goes on struggling right up to the end. And if you believe in the new religion of life, you admire your fellow human being. You're doing the same. Notice today that we no longer admire people when they get a terminal illness for submitting in a resigned way to the will of God. We praise them for fighting to the end, like an animal. Interesting. So there's a respect in which religion is profoundly changing now. We're changing over to a sort of all-accepting attitude to life, and we're making a lot less, therefore, of the problem of evil. In the older faith, with a very strong contrast between God and the world, the problem of evil was very difficult. Why did God permit evils? In the newer thing, if you want to say yes to life as a whole, you think one should do as little complaining and as little hostile judging as possible. One should be as generous as one can to other people and about the human situation, and one should, as people say, take the rough with the smooth. The typical utterance of the new life religion. Taking the rough with the smooth, taking life as it comes. Well, that will give you some introduction to the ideas of life that I put forward first in this book 3 years ago, but this is out of print, and if you want one, you have to search the internet, because I'd search it myself to buy up spare copies to give to people. And the second book, Life, represents a more developed interpretation of the new thinking. And my object in this has been to say, I'm not just a totally berserk radical theologian, I'm also trying to articulate things that are known to us all and that are now part of our language. In England, I'm treated as so radical as to be completely off the wall, if that expression is known here. But my retort in the life books has been to say, no, I'm only trying to articulate the religious meaning of the culture we've actually got and the language we're actually using. So I've tried to find a way to get back at my critics, and I'd now love to hear your reactions, because I've not had a previous opportunity to speak about these things in this way in the States.